Day for the victims of all totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, the 23rd of August, marking the anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August the 23rd, 1939. So, as I said, through the secret protocol of this pact, Germans and Soviets carved Europe into spheres of influence, and this is why this date was chosen to commemorate all the hardships and the victims of the different authoritarian regimes that have marked the history of the 20th century. In the aftermath of wars and dictatorships, the questions of how to deal with war crimes and crimes against humanity was the most difficult one and was answered very differently depending on the time, countries, and international constellations involved. A showcase in the permanent exhibition of the House of European History that those of you who took the guided tour have seen shows how different the approaches were in the aftermath of World War II to address Nazi crimes and collaboration. Sometimes it was addressed violently through spontaneous revenge actions, sometimes based on legal action, and this is what we are going to see today, and sometimes as outcomes of international cooperation. Last March, our museum acquired an important object that completed this showcase, and this is what we are going to speak about today. A film screened during the Nuremberg Trials from 1945 to 46. Before joining the museum collection, this film negative was in the hands of Sandra Schulberg, our guest speaker today, the daughter and niece of the filmmakers who originally crafted it. This film is not just a relic, it's a testament to the pursuit of justice, as the film assembles different footage filmed by Nazi officers themselves while they were perpetrating atrocities, or filming the outcomes of their actions. And so the film became a piece of proof in the trials in Nuremberg. The Nuremberg trials paved the way for international tribunals and a framework for the future International Criminal Court. However, as we can see today, it could not prevent war crimes to repeat. Tonight we will watch the documentary Filmmakers for the Prosecution, produced by Mrs. Schulberg. And this film unveils the remarkable journey of the Schulberg brothers, Mrs. Schulberg's father and uncle, two American soldiers who employed their energy finding the remaining footage of the atrocities to bring justice to light. Sandra Schulberg's documentary brings to light the urge pace that the filmmakers were working with to produce a film as an evidence to convict perpetrators of war crimes. And it's important to mention that this film contains material that may be sensitive for some viewers. Speaking of Sandra Schulberg, our guest tonight, she is president of Indie Collect and has dedicated all her efforts to resurrecting and preserving forgotten film negatives. And so she will be sharing the story of her family's connection to the Nuremberg trials and the intriguing journey of cinematic storytelling in the context of history. Mrs. Schulberg, thank you very much for being with us tonight. We look forward to speaking to you, exchanging with you after the film. And I will now leave the floor to the film, which we are going to see first. Thank you very much for being with us.
We are very, very grateful today that we have Miss Sandra Schulberg here with us. Afterwards, there will be some time for some Q&A here in the room, but also online. We are very honored to have you here, Miss Schulberg. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm very grateful to the museum. I've worked with Christine Dupont, Peter Jan, Pauline, and Simina, and your colleagues on bringing the film here. I want to thank you so much, and I want to thank all of you in the audience for coming. You know, this is heavy material in some way, in many ways, and so your interest is very, very much appreciated. I think I'll start. I want to make sure we leave a lot of time to have a conversation with each other, but I want to start by making a few comments regarding, really keying off what Eli Rosenbaum says at the end of the film. You know, he speaks with great regret, really, about how disappointed he is and how disappointed Justice Jackson and his colleagues would have been that we haven't brought an end to war. What he means by that, and is it Saskia who led the tour before, mentioned the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was kind of the first attempt legally to outlaw war. I think what is interesting, fascinating really, and not so well known, not so well understood, is that counts 1 and 2 of the indictment at Nuremberg really were dealing with the very act of starting a war, of initiating a war, of committing what was defined as the crime of aggression, that is an unprovoked war. And what Justice Jackson, who was a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, but he was acting as a prosecutor at Nuremberg, which is quite unusual, and he was not so good at it, as people discovered when he was trying to cross-examine Hermann Göring, for example. But intellectually and juridically, I think he was very powerful, and he was a true visionary. And he was trying to use counts 1 and 2 of the indictment as a way of reinforcing this idea that it should be a crime under international law to wage war. Now, I worked for many years with Benjamin Ferencz, who just died a few months ago, who was our last surviving Nuremberg prosecutor. And he would always say to me, Sandra, the greatest crime against humanity is war itself. He really believed that. And he prosecuted the Einsatzgruppen, which was a later trial, a very important trial. And Justice Jackson himself says in his opening statement and in other statements that, you know, all the crimes derived really from the crime of aggression. Now, why do I start with this theme, and why does it continue to provoke and fascinate me? It's partly because, you know, thanks to Ben Ferencz and others, the International Criminal Court was finally created here in The Hague. And at first, the crime of aggression did not come under the jurisdiction of the court because because the crime of aggression is such a contentious concept. It's one that goes to the very heart of a country's sovereignty, you know, the traditional right to wage war as an instrument of foreign policy. And so this was why they had just come out of World War II. World War II felt like, for some, including Roosevelt, a very reluctant war because people had just relatively recently survived World War I. And there was just this tremendous hunger to find a way to end war. And so Eli is referring to that because, of course, the Nuremberg trial did not end war. And today we are faced with almost a textbook case of the crime of aggression when it comes to the invasion of Ukraine, for instance. And yet there is also a great irony here because Russia, the United States, China, and Israel are not members of the International Criminal Court. They are not. None of these countries, including, you know, my own, although I was born in France and raised the first part of my life in Europe, but I'm an American citizen, and I'm not proud of this fact that the United States, as well as these other major powers, and Israel, ironically, are afraid to be judged by an international criminal court, especially as relates to the crime of aggression. So I'm just laying this out because I hope we'll have some conversation about this, and I'll be interested to hear some of your comments about it. The other important thing about the trial is that it also, people, I've traveled around the US and around the rest of the world with the original film about the trial that my father made that the museum just acquired and is now, Saskia showed you the can upstairs, the 16 millimeter print of Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, that we used to put our wine glasses on for decades and decades before we realized what it was. As I traveled around the world with the film, I realized that very, very few people know that we have had on the books, nationally and internationally, a definition of war crimes for a very, very long time. In fact, the very first trial for war crimes was held in 1674, the trial of Peter von Hagenbach, which is a fascinating case to read about. And then, with the Lieber Code during the Civil War and of course coming out of the Crimean War, and the Hague Conventions, which you referenced, and the Geneva Conventions, this has been built upon. So we have this quite long history of the definition of war crimes and the accountability for war crimes. What was new about the Nuremberg trial, as you said also, Saskia, during the tour, is that they attempted to codify this relatively new concept, crimes against humanity. And I think when most people think about the Nuremberg trial, if they know anything at all, they think about crimes against humanity, and they think about the Shoah. They think about the murder, not just of millions and millions of Jews, but the persecution and murder of also homosexuals and gypsies and people who were just simply against the Nazi regime. So this concept of genocide that Raphael Lemkin coined, he tried very hard to persuade Justice Jackson to use the word genocide in the original indictments of the first Nuremberg trial, but he failed to do so. And there was a tremendous amount of sensitivity and ambiguity and hesitation on Jackson's part and on the part of the other prosecutors about how much emphasis to put on the persecution and annihilation of the Jews, because they wanted to universalize this sort of historic tribunal and not seem to make it only about a specific group of people. So that in itself is quite contentious, but they were very worried about this, which we can also discuss afterwards. And that is, I think, part of the reason why Jackson did not want to use the word genocide in the indictment of the original International Military Tribunal, but Ben Ferencz did use it very consciously. He got to know Lemkin quite well. Lemkin was given an identity card to attend the trial. He did attend the trial, and he was lobbying the whole time to get the word used. And Ben Ferencz did use it in his prosecution of the Einsatzgruppen. So that's all I want to say. There's so much more to talk about, but that's really all I want to say kind of about the structure of the trial itself and the four indictments. The next thing I'd like to tell you a little bit more about is this whole question of using motion picture evidence or motion pictures, period, as evidence in a court of law. I mean, that had never been done before. And Jackson's own team, legal team, was very skeptical about this. And we know this really from a letter my father wrote dated November 9, which was just before the trial started, in which he says, writing home to my mother, they had just been married in April of 44, and they were very much in love. My father missed my mother terribly. My father was an inveterate reporter. He had a typewriter with him. The only critique I have of Jean-Christophe's wonderful film is that he shows my father writing with a quill pen, which he didn't do. He always typed all the letters, but it's more romantic with the quill pen. Anyway, he wrote on November 9, he wrote home to my mother that he wrote, "We have finally managed to make," this is a quote, "we have finally managed to make stuffy attorneys picture conscious. At first, they didn't want to have anything to do with us, and now they're calling us to ask if we have a photograph of Raeder giving the Nazi salute, for instance, or what's his name at Mauthausen, for instance, which was a key turning point in the trial." And he goes on to say, "Justice Jackson called our editing room today to thank us for our work and to say," this is a quote, "a picture is worth 1,000 words." And so Jackson had this idea, along with Donovan, head of the OSS, that film could be used to help substantiate the 4 counts of the indictment. I'm sorry, my uncle is so hard to understand, and we should have had the whole thing subtitled in English, and we will soon, because it may have been hard for you to understand his words, but he talks about how important this, this footage is. And then, of course, Eli says, we can all imagine somebody walking down the street and somebody holds a gun to our chest, but we can't really imagine the scale on which this genocide was committed, and in such a really on a factory scale during World War II, and only images can really persuade you that this actually happened. But because they had this doubt about, when you find a document, it normally says to whom it's from, to so-and-so and from so-and-so, and it has a date. And so it kind of announces itself. It tells you, by its very definition, a written document generally tells you what it is. With film footage, that's not the case. You don't know when it was shot. I mean, you might, if you knew the edge numbers and you're someone in the film business, you can look up when a piece of film was actually printed, but you don't know who shot it, when they shot it, unless you have the camera bobine, the camera reel that tells you when and where it was shot, but you don't necessarily have that information. You don't know why it was shot, so you don't know the purpose of it, and therefore it is questionable. How do you use it in a court of law? And so they came up with a kind of a cheat, which the museum now has a copy of the booklet I wrote about this, and in that are the copies of the affidavits. So what they did is they created a written affidavit signed in one case by John Ford, in another case by Ray Kellogg, who we see in the film. And they photographed that, and they just stuck that at the beginning of the films. so that, and they gave it an evidence number. And this is how they sort of tried to give these pieces of film the character of legal evidence. And because it was questionable, right? This was a new thing. How should they treat it? Now, the other thing I want to say about the use of film in the courtroom, and then the film about the trial, which uses film that was shown in the courtroom. And now you're seeing another film about the making of the film about the trial in which film was used. So this is a very meta experience, if you'll pardon that conception. And it's every filmmaker makes, there's no such thing as, I would say, as documentary truth, veracity in a film, because whenever you put one image next to another image, I mean, whenever an editor or a director is doing that, he or she is making a creation that has an impact on you, right? You're not really able to deconstruct that. And you consume it. Unless you're trained to look at this, unless you're trained to deconstruct this film document, it's very hard to argue with it as you're watching it. So I want to give you, because I believe in trying to help you understand how to analyze and argue with this, I want to just give you one or maybe two examples of what I mean by this and what could be construed as misappropriation. So when we work with archival film material and we take it out of context, we have to talk about misappropriation. Because unlike when you read a scholarly work, let's say, or even a relatively popular book of nonfiction, you'll see footnotes either at the bottom of the page or at the end of the chapter or at the end of the book. But we just showed you a film in which we should have had footnotes at the bottom of every scene or at the end of the film that tell you every shot of archival footage that was in there, where it was shot, when, what we know about it, and how it's used in this film, which could also be a case of misappropriation. So I'll just give you one example. Big Better, who was the assistant to the French judge and who was, as he says, 21 or 22 in the film, he talks about in particular about the image of the bodies being bulldozed and that is Bergen-Belsen, although it's sort of hard to grab that if you don't really know. But anyway, it's Bergen-Belsen, and these are SS guards, throwing the bodies into the pit and driving the bulldozers. Now, if I tell you that they were doing that under the command of British officers, does that change how you see it? If you think that this is what the Nazis were doing, this is how they were treating these cadavers, these mainly Jewish victims of the Holocaust, that they were dumping them into this pit, you can't even really dignify it by calling it a grave. And they're bulldozing these bodies. If you think those are the Germans doing it, do you think of it one way? If you know that it's being done under the command of the British liberators, do you think of it a different way? I mean, I'd love to hear your reactions to that once I stop talking. But that's one example where the context is perhaps important. I'll never forget, I showed the original film, Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, I love showing the film to law students in particular, and try to guide them into international criminal law. And I remember when I showed it at Fordham University, after the screening, I told the class that this was done under the command at Bergen-Belsen of British officers, and they were so shocked. They were like terribly disappointed, and they felt tricked in a way. And that's when I realized how critical it is, or how it can change your perception. Knowing the context can change your actual experience of a piece of film. There's another scene in Bergen-Belsen that we see very briefly in Filmmakers for the Prosecution, where there are naked, very emaciated naked men and women in a gas chamber. They're still alive, but you have the feeling that they're about to be exterminated. And that is also a scene that was shot at Bergen-Belsen after the liberation. It's not Nazi footage that you're seeing. They're not about to be exterminated. They're about to be saved, although they may not survive after being rescued. Whereas the footage from Mogilev, where you see the man and this very, very tiny woman and others being taken into that brick shed with the exhaust fumes from the automobile attached to the shed, that was shot by a high-ranking SS officer, Arthur Nebe, who interestingly took the film, hid it in his house in Berlin, where my father found it, and turned against Hitler, and was sentenced by Judge Freisler and garroted. He was killed by the regime. So somewhere between supervising that, what we think may be a very early experimental gassing or experiment with the gassing of human beings, he changed his mind about the morality of the war. So that's just another interesting comparison of the kind of footage that my uncle and father were gathering, how they used it, how it got shown in the courtroom, how it then got repurposed, because as Axel Fischer says, people who make a film today about the Shoah or Nuremberg, they're going back to, in many, many cases, the very same footage that was collected by the OSS team, edited by the OSS team, presented in the courtroom, or presented by the Russians. So, I think one of the amusing things about this story is that there was this competition. Originally, and I found all this in my father's papers, originally the four allies were going to make one film about the trial, and they were going to work together on it. They had this, what they call the four-party documentary working party. But the rivalry and arguments that took place between Washington and Berlin, between the U.S. Department of War officials in Washington and General Clay and his staff in Berlin, became so protracted that the Russians just lost complete patience with this idea of making one film amongst the four allies. So they decided to make their own film, and they put it in the hands of Roman Carmen, who is an extraordinary filmmaker, and you got to see, also very handsome man. You got to see him in the courtroom. And they made their own film. They beat my father to the punch. They got their film finished a year before my father's film was finished, and they showed it not only of course, in Russia and in the Eastern Bloc, but they showed it in Times Square. They rented the Stanley Theater in New York City, and they kind of won the propaganda battle in that sense by being first to the screen with the story of the trial. What's interesting, and we tell that story in this film. They shared footage with the Americans, and in fact, all the footage shot in the courtroom was also shared amongst all the Allies. So all of this footage, whether it was shot by the Germans, whether it was shot by Russians or Brits or American camera teams, whether it was shot in the courtroom, it was all shared so that anyone could take from that material. And people have been taking from that material ever since. So I know there are people in this room who've seen images that were in this film, probably in many other films, because there's kind of a limited stock of material to choose from. Anyway, I'll stop haranguing you at this point, and maybe come sit over here, and we can try to have. Do I need to? Okay. Oh, lovely. Okay.
So then we'll open the floor, both online and on site. So, is there anyone who'd like to ask a question to our guest? Yes.
It doesn't have to be a question, by the way. I mean, I'm very interested in your own experiences, so don't feel you have to ask a question. I would love to know your name, however.
Of course I will. Good evening and many thanks. My name is Isabel van den Week. I'm Belgian, married to a German. So anyway, it's the past, of course, and but it does still live in a lot of German in the society about whether they should have or should not have a feeling of guilt. But that was not my main comment.
I'm not sure your mic is working, is it?
Do you hear me well?
Oh,
Do you hear me better?
That's much better, thank you.
Have you understood me so far?
I think so, yes.
Good. I've read this fantastic book, East-West Street from Philip Sands, which really fascinated me a lot because it really puts this genocide into words. And this film really helped me to understand that book even better. So it was a treasure. We could see the past hour. Many thanks for that. My question is now, in these months where your father and your uncle went on the field, how did they find about all these different treasures? How did it work? Was there a German team? Because I suspect they didn't speak German. That they have German locals who would help them and try to find out about where to find this footage. Do you know more?
Yes, your question is, as they were hunting for these film materials, how did they find them? Where did they find them? Did they have German informants? Yes, Budd mentions some of the informants. I mean, Kurt von Molo was one of their informants, and the other was Walter Rode. It was Rode who I think suggested they look at Grasleben, where the mine. They did have a young assistant editor who was German that they hired. In fact, I got to interview her shortly before her death, Lieselotte Walter, who was an assistant cutter at Babelsberg that they hired to join the team. But I don't think Lilo, as she was called, was of any help in terms of finding material. They were looking in all sorts of places. I mean, they did look in some of the obvious places, like the Bavaria Studio. My father writes about films they found at the Bavaria Studio. They found, of course, a lot at the Babelsberg Studio, as you saw in the film. What's funny is, that very hokey film that Jean-Christophe's archival researcher found of my father, I figured out that has to have been filmed while they were making Nuremberg its lesson for today, or perhaps it was a promo film, like a teaser that they were making just before the release of Nuremberg its lesson for today in Stuttgart and the rest of Germany. It's so hokey that it's completely, you can tell it's all fake. I mean, the two guys in the Jeep who go to the farmer's yard and they're, this, and then they dig with the pitchfork. There's more of that footage where they dig up film in a row of crops in the ground. But the fact is that those are incidents that I found described in my father's letters. So, it's hard to believe, but that they did find some material that way. They did. And then, in a way, as I said, probably the most shocking material was what was found in Arthur Nebe's Berlin apartment, the footage of the Mogilev gassing. So it was a race against time. They found things in obvious places and very unlikely places. I think the greatest regret, though, that, as you heard Budd say, is that they found, so much film that had been recently burned. I mean, that was huge caches. And then there's also, there is footage, there's always been rumored, and I think it's more than a rumor, that there was footage of a number of the executions of people who were judged by Judge Freisler, who was the kind of notorious Nazi judge. And that material was apparently, because Budd went to Switzerland to try to find it, but it was apparently spirited out of Germany by the Soviets. But there's footage in Moscow, I think, that has still yet to be made public. And that's some of that footage. Now, it's also interesting, even though, again, not only did Jean-Christophe cheat, but most films cheat this. The tribunal was very, not only did they not want much filming done during the courtroom, but during the trial, but they specifically banned the filmmakers from filming the faces of the defendants or filming the day that the judgments were pronounced. They felt that filming the faces of the defendants, or filming the defendants, period, at the moment in which they were going to hear whether they were going to live or die, was inappropriate. I mean, it was a kind of pudeur, we'd say in French. I'm not sure the best word in English, but sensitivity even to people that you thought were monsters. And likewise, there was no filming of the hanging of the defendants, the 11 who were hanged in the Nuremberg prison, because that was also considered to be inhumane. They did allow photographs, partly to prove that these men had actually been executed. They did allow photographs of the men after they'd been cut down and they were dead, but no motion pictures and nothing about the death. So when you see in this film or any other film, the narrator tells you it's October 1, 1946, and the verdict is being read, and you see the defendants' faces, those are shots of them from other days, not the day they heard whether they were going to live or die. And similarly, the film, when you're a filmmaker, you have to tell a story. You have to find a way to tell a story. And so you use the images you have at hand to tell the story you're trying to tell. And those images are not necessarily truthful to that moment. I mean, that's what we do as filmmakers. And but you as the consumer, you have to be sort of attuned to this. you can watch something once to take it in, but then maybe you should watch it a second time with questions, questioning each edit, each shot. I mean, I'm joking in a way, but that's in a way what this kind of work requires, this research requires.
Thank you. Do we have another one here in the room? Yep.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Juuso Järviniemi. I'm originally from Finland. We are talking about lessons for today, and you also mentioned the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine. Now, of course, times are quite different as we are observing the crimes that Russia is committing in Ukraine today. We have a constant stream of video footage of what is happening in the country. On the other hand, we are also living in an age where footage can be manipulated more easily than in the past. So
where footage can be manipulated, is that what you said?
Manipulated, yes. Mm-hmm. We speak of deepfakes and so on and so on. So my question is, what can we learn from this experience at Nuremberg when it comes to holding Russia accountable for the crimes that the country is committing today?
Well, I think what we mainly probably have to learn is patience, because unlike the Nuremberg trial, which was held, incredibly fast, considering how many people were indicted, how voluminous the evidence was on both sides. I mean, the defense had a huge amount of evidence that it presented in defense of the defendants by very, for the most part, renowned German lawyers who were all paid for by the Americans to properly defend the German war criminals, let's say, or alleged war criminals. But that was that has not been repeated. I mean, when you look at the Yugoslav tribunal, the Rwanda tribunal, and both of those happened relatively soon after those crimes. But many, many, many of the crimes being prosecuted by the International Criminal Court are taking, 10, 12, 15 years to prosecute and to bring to trial. So I would say, and then there's the problem of, arrest. I mean, to prosecute someone, in fact, at Nuremberg, there is generally a law against prosecuting someone in absentia. At Nuremberg, they did prosecute one person in absentia because they thought they were about to catch him. It turned out he was already dead. But they made an exception, but in theory, you're not supposed to prosecute anyone in absentia in such important criminal cases. So then you have the question of apprehension, and so even if you decide you're going to indict certain actors for war crimes or crimes against humanity, you still have to capture them and bring them to trial. And so I think this is going to take a very long time. And then you have the problem that, as I said earlier, that Russia is not a member of the International Criminal Court. So now if the crimes are committed on the territory of a country that is a member, then there can be a basis for prosecution, but that doesn't make it any easier to get the defendants into the courtroom. So I think this is going to be a very long process. That doesn't mean that it isn't worthwhile. And there's a tremendous amount of evidence being gathered. In fact, Eli Rosenbaum, and I think this is a great irony, but Eli Rosenbaum, whom you see in the film, has been named the top American war crimes prosecutor for Ukraine by the U.S. Department of Justice. But again, it's sort of, ironic, because this is a country that is not a member of the International Criminal Court wanting to accuse another member of the crime of aggression that's not a member of the International Criminal Court and not subject to its jurisdiction. So Eli is working in many ways very hard to help the Ukrainians gather the evidence. And I think that's, a good thing. That's a positive thing. But I think the United States will be somewhat paralyzed in its attempts to be part of the process of holding anyone accountable for these crimes. And then, of course, there's the question of war crimes being committed on the other side, too. I mean, that's the problem, is that war tends to make criminals out of ordinary soldiers, because in the heat of war, you end up killing civilians, you end up almost inevitably committing war crimes. It's very hard in the course of a war to avoid committing war crimes on every side, on the part of all of the combatants. And so again, you have the question of how are you going to be fair and mete out justice and accountability wherever the investigations might lead. And I think that's one of the difficult conundrums that we face, or that any country or group of countries faces. So I don't have a easy or happy answer for you. It's not simple. It's not simple.
I think we have time for one more question. Yep.
Great. I'm very happy I managed to ask my question. First of all, thank you for this fantastic, not only film, but your presentation after, and the question of the gaze, which is also true for the photos. So yeah. The majority of photos we know from the ghettos were taken by Germans as propaganda pieces, and this is so important. And it makes us look on this footage completely differently. That's so important. I wanted to ask you one thing. I was really impressed seeing those mountains of reels that your father found. And I was wondering what happened next. So especially I'm interested in the selection, how he selected the material from such a mass. And what happened to the reels later? Where were they taken? Where were they archived? How did the process look? And were there any disputes about who takes it? Thank you.
Well, it was very, very difficult for them, and it wasn't, I also want to stress, although if you watch this film, you think it's all about Budd and Stuart Schulberg, and it wasn't just about, it's just that they wrote about it, and often history is made by those who write about it. My father wrote 300 letters home to my mother during the lead up to the trial and the trial. And Budd later wrote much less, but then he spoke about it. We got him to talk about it. The team consisted of Ray Kellogg, who was number 2 to John Ford. John Ford never came over during this process, but Ray Kellogg was there and really leading the unit. He was head of the unit. Budd was number 2. Then they had the editors that you see some of them in the film, Joe Zygmunt, Bob Parrish, Bob Webb. They took on, there were 3 women, part of the team, a Russian translator, a woman who spoke a number of other languages who was Hungarian, and then this young German assistant cutter, Lieselotte Balter. so it was really a team effort. I don't want you to come away thinking, oh, you know, it was all Budd and Stuart Schulberg. Most of the footage, so some footage went to the Imperial War Museum. Some footage was in The Hague for a while, and then for interesting reasons that I won't go into, and then mostly went to the National Archives in the United States. Of course, a lot of footage went back to Moscow, including, I think, footage that's still to be uncovered or publicly released. The German Bundesarchiv has some material. I'm quite fascinated to know what exists here in Belgium or in the French archive. I really don't know. I think it's important to remember that it's not mentioned in this film, but it is mentioned in my father's film about the trial, that the prosecutors were 4 main countries: Russia, France, the United States, and Britain, but there were 15 other countries that were also indicting these people. So they had very much background roles, but they did have roles, and they did contribute to the trial in various ways, many times in terms of helping to gather material from their own countries and making it available to the 4 main prosecution teams. So some of those countries have material as well. So it's not a simple answer. And I can't tell you what is where. You know, we're still trying to figure out, were there 35 hours shot during the trial, or was it, as Axel says, more like 38, but was that just multiple cameras? I don't think there was more. That was a question asked to me earlier. I think it was really very limited. Originally, I thought it was 25 hours, and then Axel's study has indicated that it's somewhat more than that, but it's very, very little material. So, well, if we have to adjourn, then I want to thank you again for coming and listening, and I hope now you'll take advantage of the resources here at the museum, and maybe next time I'll come back and show you the original film, Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, alongside Roman Carmen's film, because it's very, very fun and interesting. Well, I can't say fun because this is a terribly sad topic, but it's very interesting to watch the 2 films side by side and compare them, and I recommend that. And if you can get your hands on my Nuremberg edition, I've included Roman Carmen's film as an extra on the Nuremberg Blu-ray DVD edition, so as well as about 8 other films, including the ones that the Americans showed in the courtroom and the ones that the Russians showed in the courtroom. So it's quite a collection. And I think the museum will now have those materials here. I'm looking at Christine, who's one of the chief curators, for affirmation of this. But anyway, thank you again, and I bid you good night.